Can silence carry the weight of vengeance? Can Christmas bells, so pure in their chime, mask the sound of blood about to spill? In the frozen stillness of Virginia, 1831, a house stood heavy with secrets, its timbers groaning like old bones in the night. Behind every hymn sung by masters, there was a silence humming beneath, the silence of those who had no voice, no freedom, no mercy granted to them. And in that silence something darker stirred. On Christmas Eve, when joy cloaked cruelty in ribbons and candlelight, a hand waited, steady and patient, holding not faith nor carol, but an axe, and in that moment history itself held its breath. If you want to follow real stories that defy time and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigations. These are not fables, not tales softened by distance, but echoes from the past that still tremble in the present. Every name, every act, every silence recorded here carries the weight of history. Join us and let these forgotten voices guide you into the shadows where truth still lingers. The land of Virginia in 1831 breathed a rhythm of cruelty beneath the facade of order. Winter crept in with a frost that clung to the shutters, whitening the edges of fields already stripped bare. The earth, cracked and hard, seemed to mirror the lives bound upon it. The plantation stretched wide, rows of skeletal crops standing like ribs exposed to the wind. The house itself loomed over it all, its timbers groaning under the weight of years, its windows glowing faintly with the flicker of candles that did not warm the souls within. For the enslaved, this house was less a shelter and more a watchtower, a place from which eyes always lingered, measuring, weighing, and reminding them of their place. At dawn, the bell would toll, its clang not a song but a summons. Bare feet pressed into the frost-bitten soil, skin hardened from labour, yet never hardened enough against the lash of command. The fields, though resting in winter, demanded care, wood to be chopped, fences to be mended, fires to be stoked for masters who never felt the cold in the same way. Silence spread among those who worked, not the silence of peace, but the silence of survival. Words were dangerous, even glances could carry the wrong weight, so they learned to let their eyes fall to the ground, their mouths sealed, their thoughts locked behind ribs that ached with restraint. The seasons ruled with an iron hand, indifferent to the lives they carried in their tide. Summer blistered skin beneath a sun that baked the very soil. Autumn demanded the gathering of harvest with backs bent and hands bleeding. Winter brought its own tyranny, when frost bit flesh, and the thin cloth allotted to them did nothing to shield bone from the wind. The enslaved had no calendars, but their bodies carried the marks of time. The scars of last year's lashings lived alongside the fresh aches of this season's toil. Time was measured not in months, but in wounds, in whispers, in stolen moments of breath at the end of endless days. Inside the master's house, laughter often floated from the parlour, muffled by walls thick with insulation, fire, and privilege. The crackling of pine in the hearth was their music, while outside breath crystallized in the air of those forbidden to enter. The smell of roasted meat wafted across the yard, taunting men and women who boiled scraps into weak stews. The difference between warmth and cold, feast and hunger, joy and despair, was not measured in miles but in walls, walls that separated life from death, freedom from chains, command from silence. Yet even in silence a world existed. The enslaved passed looks in the dark, their eyes speaking when their mouths could not. A shared bowl of cornmeal became communion, the pressing of hands a lifeline in a place determined to strip them of humanity. Children learned early that laughter must be quiet, play must be hidden, and even tears could be dangerous. They grew up not with toys but with lessons. Never turn your back when the master's shadow passes. Never forget that every kindness given might be poisoned tomorrow. Never believe that Christmas meant the same for all. The house itself seemed to groan under the weight of these unspoken truths. At night, when wind whistled through the shutters, it was not only the branches scratching against the glass, but the echo of stifled sobs that filled its halls. The walls had listened to generations of prayers whispered into straw beds, prayers that rose and vanished into rafters where no heaven seemed to listen. The floors had felt the trembling of bare feet at midnight, carrying pails of water, carrying burdens, carrying grief too heavy for their young shoulders. Even the dogs in the yard seemed to know the order of things, loyal to the hand that fed them, yet snarling at those who carried chains around their ankles. And still Christmas was approaching, a season for the masters of feasting, music, and plenty. A season where hymns of peace and goodwill were sung inside, while outside hands cracked from labour carried wood to warm another man's hearth. There was no rest, only the irony of carols that drifted through the cold, their words promising salvation while cruelty persisted in the very same breath. For the enslaved, Christmas was not joy, but reminder. A reminder that even as bells rang and candles glowed, their own lives were the fuel keeping such lights burning. The plantation held its breath in those days before Christmas Eve. Snow fell lightly across the fields, each flake vanishing as it touched the warmth of skin that could never be covered enough. Shadows stretched longer, nights deepened with a silence that felt heavier, almost as though the earth itself was waiting. It was within that silence that thoughts grew sharper, that patience thickened into resolve. Beneath the surface of ordinary labour, beneath the routine of gathering, chopping, and carrying, something else was being gathered. Not wood, not water, but memory. Each act of cruelty, each humiliation, each lash striking deeper into the ledger of debts that one day demanded to be paid. In the fields, voices remained low, but eyes began to burn with something more than survival. In the cabins, straw beds became witnesses to whispered dreams of freedom, vengeance, or simply an end to the endlessness. The very air seemed to tremble with the weight of the unspoken. And though the masters laughed louder, sang louder, and drank more deeply in those December nights, they could not hear the silence that pressed against them, nor see that within that silence something patient and terrible was waiting. Christmas was coming, and with it the illusion of peace. Yet beyond the candles and carols, beyond the frost-laced windows, a hand was preparing to break the silence forever. Josiah carried silence like a second skin. To the masters he was another shadow moving across the yard, another body bent beneath the cold, another pair of hands bound to endless labour. But within that silence a ledger grew, written not on paper, but upon flesh, memory and bone. Each scar upon his back was an entry, each humiliation carved into the sum of his being. When his master struck him across the face for a task unfinished, the mark was tallied. When Ruth, his wife, was forced to bow her head while insults rained upon her, it was written in the book of pain that no one else could see. When his young son Samuel cried from hunger while the master's dogs feasted, the debt grew heavier still. The ledger was vast, invisible, but undeniable. Josiah carried it in the lines etched at the corners of his mouth, in the stiffness of his walk, in the dark gleam of his eyes when no one watched. To outsiders he was voiceless, obedient, broken. To himself he was patient, waiting, measuring. Silence was not surrender but survival, and every moment of restraint was another entry added to the book that would one day demand reckoning. At night, when the cabin lay cold and his children curled against Ruth for warmth, Josiah sat awake. He stared at the rafters where the wind whispered, and in that whisper he heard the tallying of years. He remembered his mother, long gone, her voice soft but firm when she told him as a boy that the earth remembers, that justice may walk with a limp, but it never loses its way. He remembered men beaten until their ribs cracked, women violated until their eyes turned hollow, and he counted each one. His mind became an accountant of grief, his heart a keeper of debts, his silence the ink that bound it all. He did not speak of revenge aloud. Such words could kill a man before they ever gave him freedom. But he sharpened his patience like a blade. In the fields he bowed his head when commanded, but his ears listened to every creak of the master's boots, every slam of the door, every careless word. He memorized routines. When the household slept, when the dogs were fed, when the key was left dangling on the nail near the cellar door. Nothing was wasted. Even humiliation became knowledge. Even pain became calculation. The ledger grew heavier as Christmas neared. The master's laughter rang louder, his drunken carols cutting through the night air, while Josiah's family went hungry. Ruth's hands were raw from washing linen that would never warm her own children, and Samuel's cough deepened in the cold. Each sound, each sight, each ache etched another line into Josiah's silent book. The weight pressed against him, not crushing, but moulding him into something unbreakable. And so Josiah became two men at once. To the master he was silent, compliant, invisible. But in the shadows, within himself, he was a keeper of debts, a recorder of cruelty, a man whose silence was no longer submission, but the sharpening of an axe no one yet saw. Josiah's silence had not always been so complete. As a boy, he had sung softly with the others in the fields, a hum that carried on the wind like a secret plea. But the master despised noise, despised even the whisper of hope, and one blow across the mouth was enough to teach Josiah that sound was a dangerous thing. From then on, he learned the art of being unseen, of allowing his voice to wither until only the earth itself knew his prayers. In the stillness of his youth he began to build the ledger, at first with small entries, the sting of hunger when food was denied, the bruise left when a boot pressed too hard. But with each year the marks grew darker, deeper, until the ledger became his companion, the silent twin that followed him everywhere. When Ruth entered his life, her eyes were weary, but her spirit unbroken. She spoke sparingly, her words soft, her laughter quieter still. Yet in the privacy of their cabin she breathed fragments of warmth into the frozen nights. Their children, Samuel and little Anna, clung to those fragments, making games of shadows cast by the firelight, pretending the world outside did not exist. Josiah watched them closely, love mingling with dread. For every smile Samuel gave, Josiah recorded another line of fear, fear of what the world would do to that smile, fear of how soon it would be stolen. The master was a man of habits, cruel not out of rage, but out of routine. He drank deeply, struck without thought, and demanded silence as his form of worship. Josiah studied him the way others might study scripture, noting the hours when his voice slurred with whiskey, the moments when his arrogance left him unguarded. Each slight was folded into the ledger, the slap Ruth received when she stumbled on icy steps, the whip Samuel nearly felt when his small hand lingered too long over a slice of bread. Josiah's silence deepened with each injustice, but the ledger roared within him, a book that could never be burned, a weight that could not be erased. Sometimes, in the dead of night, Josiah imagined the ledger aloud, whispering to the dark. one for the lash across my back, one for the hunger in my child's belly, one for Ruth's tears in the wash-house. His voice trembled, not with weakness, but with the cold precision of a man who knew that debts could not go unpaid forever. Each entry was not only memory, but prophecy. Each word etched into the silence foretold a day when the book would be balanced. The others in the quarters saw the darkness in his eyes, but said nothing. They too had ledgers of their own, though most feared theirs would never be settled. Josiah's silence, however, was different. It did not reek of despair, but carried the steadiness of stone. They sensed in him a dangerous patience, a man whose quiet was not emptiness, but gathering storm. They said nothing, for silence was their shield as well. Yet in their eyes, when they passed him, there flickered the faintest recognition, as though they knew his ledger was not a book he intended to keep forever. Winter pressed harder, nights longer, cold, sharper. Ruth's hands cracked until blood mingled with soap and water. Samuel's cough grew into a rasp. Josiah's heart tallied each sound, each pain, binding them into the silent book he carried. It was not rage that drove him. Rage burned hot and fast, but Josiah's silence was cold and enduring, like frost that spread until the very ground beneath one's feet cracked. This ledger was not only his, it belonged to his family, to his mother's memory, to every soul who had fallen unheard in the dark soil of Virginia. And so the silence thickened. It became his cloak in the day, his prayer at night, his weapon sharpening with every injustice. He spoke less and less, until even his children grew used to his quiet, learning to read his eyes rather than his tongue. Yet within that quiet, Josiah carried a clarity sharper than any blade. The debts were written, the pages filled, and one night, one cold, unholy night, they would be paid in full. Revenge for Josiah did not arrive like fire. It arrived like frost, slowly, patiently, quietly, until every surface was covered. He began not with the weapon itself, but with the silence that cloaked him. Silence was the soil from which all plans could grow. To survive had been to measure footsteps, to still the tongue, to watch and wait. To avenge was only the natural evolution of that same discipline. He studied the house as though it were scripture. Its bones creaked at certain hours. Its shutters rattled when wind struck from the east. Its doors sighed differently when opened by heavy hands than by light ones. He knew the rhythm of the master's boots on the stair, the cadence of his drunken songs, the slur that began after the third cup of whiskey. He knew when the lamps burned low and when the key to the pantry swung forgotten on its nail. Every detail of the house, every breath of its timbers, was memorized. Knowledge was the whetstone upon which Josiah sharpened his silence. Tools lay everywhere, hidden in plain sight. The axe, meant for splitting wood, leaned daily against the chopping block. Its blade bit into logs, but Josiah watched it with different eyes. Each time he raised it to split pine or oak, he imagined it splitting bone, its weight carrying not firewood but justice. Chains, meant for livestock, coiled rusting in the barn. Their cold links whispered of imprisonment, but in Josiah's mind they also whispered of a master bound rather than free. Even the spoons and knives set upon the master's table seemed to glimmer with possibility. A man who had endured enough cruelty could turn any object into a vessel of judgment. Patience became ritual. In the quiet moments after labour, Josiah's hands traced the haft of the axe, feeling the smooth wood worn by years of work. He carried logs heavier than he needed, testing the strength of his grip, the steadiness of his arm. To anyone watching, he was only labouring, fulfilling his duty, but in his silence Josiah was rehearsing. Each swing was not just for wood, but for memory, for Ruth's lowered eyes, for Samuel's hunger, for Anna's whispered prayers. Every crack of timber beneath the axe was a rehearsal for the crack of something greater. Even his prayers became sharpened. Once he had begged for deliverance. Now he prayed for clarity, for steady hands, for the strength to carry the ledger to its conclusion. He whispered not for freedom, but for balance. At night, while Ruth and the children slept, Josiah's eyes remained open. He listened to the house across the yard, its drunken songs and laughter, and he counted the hours until their voices slurred, until the lamps dimmed. He knew the rhythm of that household as surely as he knew the beat of his own heart. Christmas gave him the stage. The season cloaked cruelty in ribbons and carols, made the masters more careless in their indulgence. The house bustled with preparations, roasted meats filling the air, cider flowing freely, music carrying into the cold night. The enslaved bent under the weight of double labour, polishing silver that would never pass their lips, chopping wood to feed a fire that would never warm their hands. Yet the more they laboured, the more distracted the masters became. Drunken laughter drowned out caution. Keys were left dangling, doors left ajar, routines broken by feasts. For Josiah, it was not merely Christmas, it was opportunity. The ledger guided him. Each entry became a step in the ritual. He thought of his mother's prayers when he touched the axe, of Samuel's cough when he studied the master's sleep, of Ruth's tears when he waited in silence. Revenge was no longer an impulse, but a ceremony, each moment rehearsed and purified in patience. The axe was more than wood and iron. It was the sum of every debt. His silence was more than endurance. It was the hymn of judgment waiting to be sung. And so Josiah moved with the cold deliberation of winter itself. He spoke less, observed more, and in his silence he became invisible. To the master he was only another body, stoking the fire, another shadow moving in the yard. But within Josiah the ritual neared completion. The ledger was full, the pages heavy. On Christmas Eve, when bells rang to celebrate joy and salvation, Josiah's silence would split open at last, and the house that groaned with the weight of its secrets would bear witness to the settling of debts. Josiah's preparations stretched across nights that seemed endless, his silence a cloak that no eye could pierce. In the daylight he was invisible, labouring with the same bowed head, the same careful obedience that kept suspicion at bay. But in the still hours before dawn, his thoughts unfolded like a map, each corner of the plantation charted in his mind. He knew the paths of the dogs as they circled the yard, knew which ones barked out of habit and which ones listened before they cried. He knew which steps creaked on the back porch, which hinges groaned on the cellar door, which floorboards in the master's chamber betrayed a man's movement in the night. The house had become as familiar to him as the scars on his back, and like those scars, it would one day bear witness to a reckoning. The axe was his chosen companion. Its blade, dulled by years of splitting wood, was sharpened under the cover of necessity. Josiah drew the whetstone slow and steady across the edge, each stroke a whisper to the darkness, each spark a promise. To anyone watching it was maintenance, nothing more than the duty of a man ensuring the master's woodpile remained full. But Josiah's heart knew otherwise. Each edge honed was not for timber but for flesh, each smooth glide of stone against metal a prayer that his arm would not falter when the moment arrived. Other tools too entered his vision as symbols. The iron poker by the hearth, the rope coiled carelessly in the barn, the nails rusting in forgotten barrels, all were possibilities. He imagined each in turn, testing their weight in his hands when no one looked. Not all would be used, but each carried meaning. each one a reminder that justice could be carved out of the simplest of objects. The master had always believed his power invincible, guarded by walls, by locks, by fear. But Josiah knew that even a house thick with timber and stone could not keep out silence. Silence slipped through cracks, silence moved with the patience of frost, and silence carried with it the weight of vengeance. The days leading to Christmas carried an air of false celebration. The mistress busied herself with ribbons and pies, her voice sharp with orders that spilled into the yard. The master drank more deeply, his voice carrying songs that stumbled into curses. Guests were expected, neighbours who would arrive with gifts and laughter, their carriages crunching over the frozen earth. Josiah watched it all, each detail entering his ledger, as surely as the lash or the insult had before. The irony was bitter. They sang hymns of goodwill while his children shivered in rags. They spoke of the Saviour's birth while Samuel coughed into the straw, his body thin from hunger. Each carol was a mockery, each candle a sneer, each toast a reminder that cruelty could wear the mask of piety. Josiah's patience was tested, but patience had long ago become his only ally. He carried wood to the great hearth of the house, feeling the heat sting his skin as flames licked upward. He imagined those same flames devouring the walls, swallowing the portraits of men who had lived fat on the backs of others. He poured wine into the master's cup, his hand steady though his heart thundered. He thought of Ruth's cracked hands as she scrubbed the mistress's linens, her tears hidden in the washwater. He thought of Anna's small fingers tracing the cracks in the cabin walls, searching for warmth. Each thought was another sharpening of the blade, another tightening of his silence. Christmas Eve approached, and with it came a stillness that felt unnatural, as though the very air held its breath. The plantation seemed caught between festivity and foreboding. Snow fell lightly, covering the fields like a burial shroud, muffling sound, deepening silence. The enslaved moved quickly, forced into endless tasks, but their eyes shifted, aware of something unspoken. Josiah spoke no word of his plan. He did not need to. Silence was his language, and silence was contagious. The others felt it in the air, a heaviness, a waiting. They did not ask, did not warn, did not intrude. Each had their own ledgers, their own debts. Perhaps in some secret part of their hearts, they longed for the sound of one debt being paid at last. The night itself was chosen not by chance, but by inevitability. Christmas Eve was when masters were at their most careless, drunk on both drink and self-importance. The house would be swollen with laughter, its walls echoing with music meant to drown out the truth of the world beyond them. But Josiah knew that music could not drown silence forever. He rehearsed it in his mind, the walk across the yard, the lift of the latch, the weight of the axe in his hands. He imagined the silence breaking not with a scream, but with a crack that would split not only bone, but history itself. Revenge, he knew, was not just for himself. It was for Ruth, for Samuel, for Anna, for his mother buried in unmarked soil, for every name carried away on the wind. The ledger was full, the debt undeniable. The house that had groaned under secrets would soon groan under justice. And Josiah, silent for so long, would let silence speak in the only way it could, through the fall of an axe on Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve arrived like a shroud, heavy with frost, wrapped in the illusion of joy. Snow drifted quietly, blanketing the fields in white, but within the house candles burned and laughter poured through the windows. That master's voice rose above the others, slurred from wine, carols tumbling from his lips with the arrogance of a man convinced the world bent only for him. The house glowed, its windows like watchful eyes, while outside the cabins lay in darkness, breath rising in thin clouds as families huddled close for warmth. Josiah stood in that darkness, silent, still. The axe leaned where it always had, against the chopping block, as though waiting. He lifted it slowly, his hands steady, his breath measured. The cold iron pressed against his palm, heavier than wood, heavier than stone, heavier than memory itself. This was no tool now. This was judgment, the embodiment of every tally in his ledger. He tested its weight once more, and in that moment the silence around him deepened, as though the very earth was listening. The walk across the yard was short, yet it stretched like eternity. Each step crunched the snow, the sound muffled under the weight of night. The dogs stirred but did not bark, their bellies full from scraps tossed earlier in the evening. The house loomed larger with every pace, its walls glowing, its timbers sighing like an old beast unaware of the blow about to fall. Josiah moved with the patience of frost, slow, deliberate, inevitable. The door yielded with a whisper, its hinges long memorized. Inside, heat struck him, the smell of roasted meat and spiced cider pressing against his senses. Music floated faintly from the parlour, voices blending, careless, drunk. Shadows stretched long across the floorboards, each one alive, each one bearing witness. Josiah's silence filled the hall as he ascended the stairs, his bare feet avoiding the boards that groaned the loudest. He carried not haste, but certainty. The master lay sprawled in his chair, head lolling, mouth open, a glass dangling from limp fingers. The fire crackled behind him, throwing light that made the room dance with flickering ghosts. For a moment Josiah simply stood, watching. Here was the man who had written the pain of generations into flesh, who had carved fear into children, who had turned silence into chains. And yet, in that chair, with wine staining his lips, he was small, mortal, breakable. Josiah raised the axe. The blade caught the light, gleaming for a breath, and then descended. Time fractured, every second stretching, the swing carrying with it the weight of centuries. The silence shattered not with a scream, but with a crack, sharp and final, as bone yielded beneath iron. The sound rang out like a bell tolling midnight, a carol of vengeance that no hymn could silence. Blood darkened the wood, the hearth roared, and the house itself seemed to tremble. The walls that had listened to sobs, to prayers, to whispers, now heard only the echo of justice. The master's body slumped, lifeless, his wine spilling into the rug like a second wound. For the first time, Josiah's silence spoke, not with words, but with the finality of the act. He did not linger. The house, once a fortress of cruelty, now felt hollow, stripped of its power. Josiah turned, footsteps steady, the axe still heavy in his grip. The voices in the parlour faltered, laughter dimmed, whispers rose, but he did not run. He descended as he had ascended, each board creaking like an old witness confessing at last. The cold night welcomed him, the snow untouched, the stars distant and watching. Back across the yard he walked, silence cloaking him once more. No shout, no alarm, no pursuit followed, only the distant carols, hollow now, drifting into the frozen dark. Josiah returned the axe to the block, its blade gleaming faintly in the moonlight, as though nothing had changed. Yet everything had. The ledger was marked, the debt paid. The silence that had been his prison had become his weapon, and in the stillness of that Christmas night it had spoken louder than any song. Morning broke pale and brittle, the frost clinging to every surface like a shroud. The plantation stirred slowly, yet unease lingered in the air, as though the night had left an aftertaste no one could swallow. Word spread first in fragments, whispers carried from the great house to the cabins, from the kitchen to the yard. The master was dead. Some said he had fallen from his chair in a drunken stupor. Others swore they had heard a sound like a tree splitting in the night. The truth lay in the blood-stained rug, in the mark no hearth fire could erase, but none spoke of it openly. Neighbours arrived before noon, their carriages crunching through the snow, their faces taut with curiosity, disguised as sympathy. They entered the house and found the mistress pale and trembling, her voice cracked from retelling the same disbelief. The master, she claimed, had been taken by misfortune, struck down by chance or perhaps by God himself. No one dared suggest another explanation, though suspicion pressed behind their eyes. They looked at Josiah and the others with sharpened gazes, but none could see past the silence that cloaked him. He stood as he always had, obedient, voiceless, invisible. The enslaved community spoke only in glances, never in words. Around the fires at night they hummed low, wordless songs that carried more truth than any tongue dared risk. Children were hushed, told not to ask, told not to repeat what their ears had caught, yet in their eyes gleamed something unfamiliar, something like awe. For once fear was tempered by a flicker of possibility, the faint scent of justice carried on the cold wind. The newspapers came within days. Their ink wrapped the story in half-truths, as ink always did. "Sudden passing at Virginia Estate," the headline read, followed by whispers of illness, of accident, of a heart too weak for drink. No paper dared write the word murder. No editor dared print suspicion of rebellion. To acknowledge that silence itself had risen in vengeance was too dangerous, too unsettling. Instead, the truth slipped into margins, into rumours traded in taverns, into stories told at the edge of fields where overseers could not hear. The mistress tried to restore order, but her voice wavered. The lash still struck, the work still ground on, but the rhythm was broken. The house groaned heavier than before, its timbers carrying the echo of the axe. The fields no longer seemed merely fields. They seemed a graveyard of secrets, the soil thick with memory. The master's chair remained empty by the hearth, and no one could sit in it without shuddering. The mark upon the rug never fully faded, no matter how many times it was scrubbed. It remained like an open wound, a scar that spoke louder than the mistress's trembling commands. Josiah continued his silence, as though nothing had changed. He carried wood, he chopped, he bent his head when addressed. But within that silence grew something new. Not only patience, not only restraint, but legend. Others looked at him differently now, though their eyes quickly dropped when overseers passed. In the hidden spaces of the night, whispers named him the man who had balanced the ledger, the man who had let silence speak. Fear and awe spread equally. Some trembled, worried that vengeance would draw fire upon them all. Others breathed deeper, as though the air itself had lightened, as though they could finally taste what it meant for one act of justice to break through centuries of cruelty. No one confessed, no one accused. The silence was unbroken, a pact stronger than chains. In time, the story twisted as stories do. Some swore Josiah had struck with an axe, others claimed it had been fire, still others whispered of poison slipped into wine. The details blurred, but the essence remained. A master had fallen, and silence had been the weapon. Truth dissolved into rumour, rumour into legend, until no one could say for certain what had happened that Christmas Eve. Yet all who lived through it knew something had shifted. The house no longer stood as it once had, and the fields carried a different weight beneath their frost. They say silence has its own voice, one that lingers long after words have faded. In Virginia, the silence of Christmas Eve 1831 became more than memory. It became myth. The axe fell once, but its echo did not die. It carried into the cabins, into the soil, into the very bones of the house that had groaned with secrets. Each creak of timber thereafter seemed to recall that night, as though the house itself whispered of the debt that had finally been paid. With time, names blurred, details shifted. Some said Josiah vanished into the woods, swallowed by snow and shadow, never to be seen again. Others swore he remained among them, silent still, moving through the fields, with the same bowed head, untouchable because no one dared accuse him. There were even those who claimed he had become something more than a man, that on moonlit nights, when the frost shone white across the fields, his shadow could be seen walking toward the great house, axe in hand, his silence pressing heavier than the cold itself. The enslaved carried the story as both warning and hope. Around fires, mothers hushed children with the tale, teaching them that silence could be sharpened, that patience could become a weapon. Fathers told sons that the ledger never closed, that each cruelty written into the flesh of their people would one day find its answer. They did not name Josiah aloud, for names could betray, but in their eyes flickered a reverence, a knowing that someone had spoken for them in the only language cruelty understood. White neighbours retold the story differently. They spoke of strange accidents, of sudden death, of a curse upon the household. Some claimed the land itself had turned against its master, that the frost carried a judgment no man could escape. They whispered of shadows in the yard, of whispers carried on the wind, of a silence too deep to be natural. Fear crept into their voices, fear that what had happened once might happen again, that silence could hide a storm waiting in every field. And so the story spread, shifting with each tongue, blurring truth into legend. Yet the essence never wavered. On a night meant for joy, silence broke, and vengeance answered centuries of cruelty. The axe became more than a tool, more than a weapon. It became a symbol, a chapter in a book written not with ink, but with blood and patience. Josiah himself became less man and more echo, a haunting presence in every creak of wood, every gust of wind through bare fields, every hush that fell across the cabins at night. History forgot the details, but legend remembered. And legend does not need truth to endure, it needs silence, and silence carries farther than any song. To this day, they say, if you walk the frost-bitten fields of Virginia on Christmas Eve, you may hear it. The faint crack of an axe falling, the sudden stillness of a house holding its breath, the sound of silence turning to judgment. And you will know that vengeance, once spoken, never truly fades. It lingers unfinished like a ledger that can never fully close.